Hello and welcome to the Sydney Film Festival and to this panel discussion of filmmaker Tosca Luby's extraordinary documentary, Strong Female Lead. I'm Jennifer Byrne. I've been a working journalist and, fancy that, a woman all my life, and so I could not be happier to be moderating this because it gives us a rare chance to thrash out what really happened when Australia got its first female Prime Minister. But first, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which I sit, and I think some others, the unceded land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. I'd like to pay my respect to their elders past, present and emerging. And now let me introduce our guests. First, Lucy Turnbull, prominent businesswoman, philanthropist, who after 5 years or so on Sydney City Council rose to become the first woman Lord Mayor. She also had a ringside seat in federal politics when her husband Malcolm was elected Prime Minister. Hi Lucy, lovely to have you with us today.
Hi Jen, thank you.
Laura Tingle, journalist, essayist, TV host and commentator who has reported on Australian politics and policy. She has written books. She has been an all-round meteor in the journalistic sphere for over 25 years. Hi Laura.
Hi Jen.
And Tosca Luby, filmmaker of factual television, who has created award-winning series and documentary specials. And I would like to particularly mention Look What She Made Me Do, an extraordinary documentary that was really powerful, as is this one. And I am very happy to be with you here today to discuss your film, Tosca. It's extraordinary.
Thank you, Jen.
So tell us about Strong Female Lead. What made you want to do it? It's told, I think probably for those who have yet to see it, it is told entirely through archival footage. There is no commentary, which I think is part of the power of it. But tell us how you made that decision.
Yeah, we were thinking about archive for a long time, myself and editor Rachel Grissom-Johns, who the two of us really toiled away bubble to make the whole thing, but we'd been talking about it for a long time, and we had this idea that it could be done purely with archive because that would allow us to not use hindsight and to say, this is what happened at the time, this is not what people have decided about the events since. And when A Final Quarter came out, which is the film about Adam Goodes, the footballer whose career was 3 years in the same way that Julia Gillard's prime ministership was 3 years, that really gave us a template to say to broadcasters, look, this can be done. So people were still saying to me, do you think you'll have enough material? You know, we're worried that that you won't be able to sustain a feature-length film. And I said, well, we feel pretty confident. She was in the media every single day for 3 years. So we're pretty sure it's out there. And of course, once we got down to it, there were hundreds and hundreds of hours of not just parliamentary footage, but radio, print, television. So it was kind of an overwhelming amount of material to get through, and it took us a really long time. These projects are very different to the ones we normally do, where we go and collect our bespoke vision. This was almost the opposite puzzle, where you have this massive amount and you're paring it down and down and down. And we had cuts that were 3 hours long at some points.
Yeah, I can well imagine. And look, it's a bit. I think the film on Adam Goodes used the same device, and I remember then, and I absolutely with your documentary, because you are reviving memories as opposed to giving you new information. There's this shock of recognition of like, I thought I knew that, but oh, now it's contextualized differently. Lucy, you've got a great story about how, I mean, let's start with the end in a way, which is the misogyny speech.
Yeah.
Tell us about.
Well, like you would think that politicians' spouses listen to Parliament all day. I'm sure some do, but I never did, right? But as, you know, like I was down in Canberra, I think to do something in the evening with Malcolm, and I was, you know, sort of swinging around the apartment we had and just sort of casually turned on the television and Parliament was on, just, you know, question time was on. And I think I probably came in, it must have been at the end of the first paragraph or the second paragraph, just after Julia Gillard had stood up and started to deliver her speech. And usually it's just sort of like wallpaper, but suddenly, you know, the tone and her demeanor kind of really you know, sort of woke me up, because I hadn't seen her with that sort of, if you like, sort of, I guess, assertive sort of like
she was
stance for a long time, because she'd been going through such, you know, media trauma and political trauma. And as a human being, I felt at the time incredibly sorry, you know, and sympathetic, or empathetic, not sorry for her, but I felt terrible for the treatment she'd been getting. And I was just so proud of her and happy that she was finally standing up and giving it to misogynists with both barrels. And it was just, to me, it was a beautiful moment. And then I was staggered actually by the media coverage the next day, which said she was kind of lost the plot or whatever. It was kind of negative. And I thought, no, that was actually amazing. That was her being fully authentic. And she'd had that sort of perceived problem with authenticity from her early days as a prime minister, where she said, oh, I'm going to be the real Julia, which kind of begged the question of what she'd been up to then. So one of her challenges had been to present an authentic front, and this was authentic. So I was really, really happy that she was standing up and speaking for herself and giving back all that stuff, you could say a four-letter word here, that she had been wearing for years. And so it was a great moment for me, a defining moment. I thought, yes, go. But it was actually freakish that I saw it in real time.
Absolutely amazing, because one can apply all sorts of levels afterwards, but to have it raw. I mean, Laura, you, by contrast, were doing your job. You were being a journalist. Tell us, what was your reaction when she did that? Because there's a backstory here which is completely different to what I think I'd thought.
Yeah. So, just sort of taking up the sort of Lucy theme of where were you on the day sort of thing. I was actually in the Fin Review office, which is in Parliament House. I wasn't in the actual press gallery in the chamber. We had a sort of a parliamentary sketch writer who would write about Question Time, so he was in there. And as the years have gone past, I found it a little bit harder to hear what's going on when I'm actually in the chamber. And I was watching it and thinking, wow, this is pretty extraordinary. But the context of the speech is often lost in the story. And I know when I've been heckled at writers' festivals and things in the past, when I've tried to explain this, people don't really, feel very tolerant of the explanation. But I mean, what was happening that day was actually that there was a vote of no confidence, effectively, in the Speaker of the House, Peter Slipper, who was a strange character. And there'd been a revelation that morning that he'd sort of sent these offensive messages about women to somebody. And the long and short of it was that if the government, if the opposition had successfully carried this motion against the Speaker, the government would lose its numbers on the floor of the House. That is, they would basically lose government. So what anybody will tell you within the Labor ranks, from Julia Gillard onwards, was that the purpose of the speech in the sort of parliamentary strategic sense was it was a filibuster. That is, it was a speech designed to give Anthony Albanese, who is the leader of the House, sort of the leader of government business, if you like, in the House of Representatives, time to try to make sure that the government would have the support of the crossbench, and that the crossbench would not vote with the opposition against the Speaker. Now, so as a journalist, you're sort of sitting there going, is the government going to fall? Which is a bit distracting from, from the subject matter at hand. But at the same time, you've got these two things happening. You've got that story happening and wondering, are you going to see a government fall in front of your eyes? Then you've got this extraordinary speech going on, which, as Lucy says, was just so full on and so passionate. And I mean, the thing that got me was, the great moments in Parliament are where people get up and deliver like that so articulately, basically without having been able to prepare any notes. They just got to go for it. Now, lawyers have that training, but nonetheless, they are spine-tingling moments. And that was my reaction to it, that this was an extraordinary speech. And I was sort of shocked when people who'd been in the chamber, journos who'd been in the chamber, came back and sort of said, oh, well, that was just a bit of, talk about bunging it on. And I'm sort of going, well, that's a bit of a weird reaction. Anyway, the day unfolded as it did, and we can talk a bit further about that, but that is the context in which that speech was being sort of seen.
I must say, for me, when I first heard that, it did slightly take away from my totally emotional. I mean, I actually literally have the detail. I just thought that was one of the most extraordinary, powerful speeches a woman, well, ever in Parliament. But then I thought, looking back on it, you could argue that it actually showed what a consummate politician, as well as an excellent woman, she was. Because she may not have played every hand right, but if you can, when you've got to come up with a filibuster of that standard, you'd have to give a bit of credit for that. Tell us, Tosca, for you, you're sort of come along at a different time with probably different memories and recollections and experiences than we've had, because, I remember when I first went to work, you still weren't allowed to have female tram drivers, and you couldn't have female pilots. So, things have changed. What was it like for you when you heard that speech, that moment?
I actually had two babies at that point, so I was in such a completely different world myself. But I was so excited about Julia Gillard becoming Prime Minister, and then I was so disappointed. I felt that what had happened to her, where had her personality gone? It was all those same attitudes, I think, that so many people had at the time, that she had become so robotic. And so when I did hear that speech, I thought, oh, there it is. There's Julia Gillard. And if only, but it came at the end, and actually, interestingly, making the film, if you look at a narrative arc, that kind of is naturally where it would end, on a high at the end of that speech. But we had to kind of dip back into the real story and say, no, after that point, it got worse, and she was out. So, as much as we all celebrated, or we didn't, but people generally internationally celebrated that speech, for her, it kind of made no difference in terms of how we could see it on a timeline. But I have to say too that I felt the speech she gave on the day that she left was almost as good as the misogyny speech. And yet people don't know that one.
I think the question I had looking at your documentary, and I'd like to get a sense from you, Laura and Lucy, whether you had something similar, which was, how did we let this happen? Were we asleep on the job as women? Because it was only when it was threaded together that you, and maybe it was different for you, Laura, because you were sort of closer, but I remember thinking, I hadn't put it together like this. So let's start with you, Lucy, because you were like at a greater distance.
Well, there was a whole kind of track, a narrative track, which was, to me, very disturbing. And, the fact of the matter was, as I guess, you can't you try to call it out. So, like where can you call these things out if you're like a normal citizen wandering around the place and you do have a partner in politics? So I would call it out especially when other women went off about her and the clothes she wore and stuff, just in social conversations and, casual contacts. I would call it out and say, you sure that's really aligned with your values that I've heard you express all your life? And I remember there was one conversation I had with a journalist. I dare say it wasn't either of you two or either of you three, but one person for whom I had a huge level of respect, went off when there was that campaign photograph of her with the bowl of fruit, right? In the, she didn't have a bowl of fruit in the kitchen. Kitchen was looking very non-homemaker, right? And this is a house in her electorate where she lived, and she probably spent 1 or 2 nights a week there. You know, I just thought she was being held to such an unfair and unreasonable standard. It absolutely, you know, it actually made me think the world was actually going semi-crazy. And then the other sort of like low point or high point or significant point for me was on Q&A when Germaine Greer, who is one of the grandmothers of the feminist movement, went off about the size of her bottom. I mean, to me, I've actually had an ambivalent attitude towards Germaine Greer for reasons I won't bore you with, but I lost all respect for her at that point, because any woman who can say that about another woman, about her physical appearance when she's the Prime Minister, is just appalling. So, you know, there was just sort of incident after incident after incident. And I guess the pile-on really was a matter of, you know, it was like a huge pile-on ongoing for years. And it was amazing that she actually tolerated it. But there were certain high points I'll never forget. And most of them were when other women piled onto her.
Mm. Well, I must say, I think you put it together really strongly in the documentary, Tosca. Because you've got the comedies of her and her partner Tim, and the vile attitudes, the vile questions they were asked. Is he gay? Is he a walker for her? I mean, just nothing that I've ever heard other prime ministers be subjected to. So, I mean, I'd like to ask you, Laura, because you were there in the gallery, you were doing your independent job, which you have to do, but you are in a world, and I think, you know, Tosca's doco shows this so much, particularly with the cartoonists of the time. These just, they thought ribald, but I mean, you and I would look at them and just think deeply offensive portrayals. How did it happen? How did that happen 8 years ago, I suppose? Were things different, or?
Well, it's interesting, Lucy's point about women being so savage about her. I'd actually sort of blanked that out of my memory, you know, because it was true. I mean, the most vicious things that people would say to you about Julia Gillard were actually usually said by women. And I have to say, watching Tosca's doco, I mean, I got a preview copy and I had to keep walking away from it because it was just, you know, they were all things I'd seen, but, you know, it's just that bombardment of images. How did it happen? Look, I think if I was sort of reflecting on my colleagues in the gallery at the time, I don't think there was that hostility. I don't think there was a sort of a sexist hostility to Gillard in the way press gallery journalists approached her. Now, you know, these days, the press gallery is actually a very small part of, you know, the media who covers politics, obviously. But I thought about this a lot after watching the doco, and it's something that I've been thinking about a lot anyway, which is this general point that the misogyny speech is sort of seen as such a high point, but how did we get to that point? How did we treat this woman beforehand, and why, as you say, Jen, did that happen? And I think it was, from my perspective, that I certainly had the view, right, she's a prime minister. You know, it doesn't matter whether she's a woman or a bloke. She's a prime minister, and I will report on her and assess her on that basis. Now, my feeling was that was also her expectation of how she expected to be assessed, and of the way her colleagues, female and male, expected her to be assessed. It was a real shock to suddenly see sort of the viciousness of the sort of Larry Pickering bizarreness. That this was quite early on in the role of social media in political influence, and I think you'd sort of, and Alan Jones saying she should be drowned in a chaff bag and stuff like that. You just go, well, this guy's a jerk, you know, this guy is just appalling. He's just trying to do this for, you know, sensational reasons.
But these guys were the powerhouses of the time.
Yeah, but you sort of didn't, you know, you just thought, this is ludicrous, you know, this is just silly, this is just awful. And so it's sort of like we missed it, and, you know, and it was never called out for that reason, because you sort of thought that it was obviously awful and that people knew that. And
can I suggest also, Laura, that it's and or maybe it's more appropriate for Tosca, but it's also a timing thing, because the women of your stage, as in senior women at the time, had grown up in an era which was sort of the 70s, 80s feminists, which were all about saying, we're as good, women are as good as men. We have no special pleading. We don't ask for exemptions. We compete on an equal field. And as it's turned out now, of course, we hear these terrible stories, and in lots of ways, Tosca is dealing with one of them, but all the stories about Don Burke, or the stories that came out later, but it wasn't in the culture. That I wondered, Tosca, did you come across that as a differential in the time you made the film, and also when you were reporting on that time? Did you ask yourself, where were the women?
Yeah, I thought about the press gallery a lot and thought, what were women? I thought about you guys constantly. What were you thinking? How were you reacting to this? And I've had a few women say, I know that Catherine Murphy, for example, said, I kind of was I didn't want to believe that that's what it was. I didn't want to believe that it was just sexism. So I don't know, Laura, whether you felt like that, but.
Oh, I mean, I thought I thought there was sexism there, but I don't think are you talking about in the gallery itself, or?
Well, throughout her prime ministership, that I think also Gillard didn't. I think she made it difficult for everyone in that she didn't want. It's exactly what you said. She didn't want to be singled out for being a woman. She had. I know she's been compared to the school prefect who thought, if I behave in the right way, everyone else will too.
Yeah.
Well, actually, can I get your answer to that on Lucy? Because I think that is a valid thing. She didn't want to have her posse. She didn't want protective people around her.
Yeah, well, she didn't want to, portray herself or be portrayable as a victim, which I can completely respect and understand. But the fact that there was no kind of, like sisterhood, I guess empowered or engaged to speak up for her, I think was enormously sad. And I think, and clearly it would have been because she didn't want it, and she wasn't trying to silence people, I'm sure. But it would have been really good if, and I think Penny Wong in the documentary Tosca, there were a couple of incidents where Penny stood up for her, which were really good. But there wasn't enough of it. And like in the Annabelle Crabb one, I've got to blanked out what it's called.
Misrepresented.
What was really good at the tail end of that was women coming around in a bipartisan or multi-partisan way to support the legalization of RU486. And that was a high point. And it was very sad that there was no similar high point where women around Parliament, all sides of Parliament, actually stood up and said, no, this is not acceptable. And I think that was actually a low point, because, even other female politicians were revolting about it, revolting. And it just made my stomach turn. But what I thought was really sad was that they thought they had license to say those things and have that mindset.
And there was nothing to stop them. I mean,
yeah.
Looking back, Laura, from where you sit now, it's a great documentary because it's incredibly hard-hitting and disturbing. Not the problem with it, but because it takes as its focus, it is true to its lens. It is about Julia Gillard and the fall and the sexist attacks. But in fact, there were a million other things going on politically at that time. So I also want to ask you, Laura, does the documentary give too much, in your opinion, weight, which is, of course, exactly what a documentary, it's a creative work, can do. Was it, in fact, sexism that was the serious problem of Gillard, or was there also just plain old politics, which he didn't play very well sometimes?
Look, I think the documentary really captures, this and makes us confront this extraordinary, ugly side of Australian political life, which is also amplified by the rise of Tony Abbott, of course, who was, was very, shall we say, no prisoners. But, if you go back to the idea of trying to assess Gillard as a Prime Minister, and you try to just cut all of that stuff off, was she a good Prime Minister? Look, my feeling is, my sort of grieving about Julia Gillard is that she would have been a really good Prime Minister 4 or 5 years later. I think that she wasn't a particularly good political strategist. They often talk about the fact they got a lot of legislation through, which they did, which was extraordinary in the circumstances. But I would say I'd give a lot of credit to that, actually, to Anthony Albanese, who really was the master of the Parliament and wrangling the crossbenchers and things. So she got a lot of stuff through, but in the haste to get stuff in place, like the NDIS, like the Gonski education reforms, they actually gave away so much, or so compromised what they put in place, that these things were sort of almost doomed to fail as a result. I know I get into terrible trouble from Jenny Macklin when I say that, but I'm sorry, that's my view. I think she was not necessarily helped by a particularly strong team. She didn't have a really first, that they were okay, but they weren't great. I think she carried a huge amount of the burden of the government because of the way she got there, if you know what I mean. She had to, it really more than a lot of prime ministers, it really, up to that point anyway, it really swung on her successes and failures. And often she made, really questionable calls and suffered as a result of those. And of course, Kevin Rudd was stalking her in the background, which didn't help, but that wouldn't have mattered if she'd been sort of a better political player. They're ones that use the term.
I'd like to come back to Lucy in a second, just to look forward a bit from how things have, if at all, changed since then. But just, I'm interested, Tosca, when you were putting this documentary together, I mean, clearly you've got a sophisticated political brain. You can see that sexism was part of the Julia Gillard story. It wasn't all, but that is the subject. Do you feel that is, was that difficult for you to make that, to make the film you wanted to make, which was basically a film about misogyny? You had to make the fall of the Gillard government about misogyny, whereas, as you know, it was more complicated than that.
Yeah, and also, I guess, a complication was that we had to build misogyny into story beats. So you had to look at those moments in the government and where that was an issue. And that was quite difficult, because there was a lot that we would have liked to put in there, but because it didn't fit into a story beat, it just couldn't go in there. Whereas when we made a trailer and you just put all those moments together, it was even more shocking than the film itself.
There was one minute when you just made a very brief reference to the carbon tax, which of course was the most, hugely divisive. And I thought, what you're doing to reduce the carbon tax to that compared to that. But, I wondered, it was a bit painful sometimes.
Yeah, we did have a cut where the carbon tax was about 45 minutes long. So, yeah, there were a lot of iterations, there were a lot of stories that hit the floor and you thought, I can't believe we're letting that one go. I mean, and people like Andrew Bolt, other characters who never even made it into the film, even though they had every right to be there. So yeah, there were a lot of decisions to be made. Also to say, we're not saying that Julia Gillard was an amazing Prime Minister. It was never meant to be a biopic about Julia Gillard, or even, I mean, the film's come out and she's been lavished in love, but that was actually never our intention. Not that I have a problem with that, but our intention was to say there was a female Prime Minister and this is what happened to her.
Yep. And I think that's an incredibly important thing that exists, that this is our first female Prime Minister and this is what we did with her. Lucy, give us some cause for hope.
Well, listen, I think what Tosca said is absolutely right, and what Laura said is absolutely right. But I think we have to be aware that there are a few threads that came together which didn't do her much help. And one of them was, when she was explaining the sudden change of leadership over a 24-hour period, she said the government lost its way. Now that wasn't probably enough of an explanation, and I think there was always kind of like a question was, why did this happen and what was driving her to do this? And that sort of mystery kind of fed into a kind of people thinking, well, what's she doing this for other than raw power? And that, not having a sort of a casus belli, to use a Latin word, but sort of like a strong positioning of why she'd done that, actually hadn't the effect of minimizing her capital, could I say. But I think in the future, I think that we have all seen this play out against a very strong female lead. And I think we're all very sad it happened. So I would like to hope that, not only, I guess other politicians, but also the media and community leaders and, advocates and spokesmen and spokespeople for women and for social inclusion actually call this out much earlier in the piece, because there was a strong element of gender bias in it. It wasn't, as she said in her final speech, it wasn't the whole story, but it was a big part of the story.
Do you think it could happen again? Or
I would like to think not. And I think that the cumulative effect of, other events that have happened since then, like the events of gender disrespect in Parliament House, visibly expressed or sort of headlined, I guess, by the experience that Brittany Higgins had as a junior political staffer, and other similar stories actually have amplified the voice of people who advocate for gender equity and respect in all its manifestations. And I think, let's be honest, the March for Justice on the 4th of March this year was actually a big turning point in women speaking up and showing that they're very, very concerned about this lack of respect across society, but in Parliament and at a level of political leadership. And I don't think that will long be forgotten. And it was great. What was great about it was you had really young people there, but much older people there. And there was this fantastic sign. I was at the town hall in Sydney, in the square there. And there was this woman who would have been about my age, and she said, "I can't believe we're doing this shit since the 1970s, right?" And that's exactly how I feel and still do feel. And I just can't believe it's still a problem, but it is, and we have to fight against it.
That's the thing. I really want to believe things have changed, and I went to those marches too. But I
saw you there.
I have a question, and it's a question for you, Laura, I guess, just in terms of opinion, not that you're responsible, of course, but which is, we were talking briefly about Brittany Higgins, the issue that's ongoing about Christian Porter, and where the money came from. Really, structurally, it isn't so different. I mean, we're now more alert. We're alert and alarmed. But actually, I just don't want to be ending up our conversation like this, but I do in my actually weaselly little female heart suspect things haven't changed so much.
There's all the sort of, let's look at the Prime Minister, and, I asked Jen what I should think about this as a sign of how much we've moved on. One of the things about politics and reporting on it, which is part of this story, is it's the boiling frog thing, and it's the same with with climate change or whatever. They're all incremental stories, and what's so shocking and powerful about Tosca's documentary is by putting it all together, you're going, oh my God, why didn't we see this, as we've been discussing? But on the day, you're just dealing with all of these little elements of it. Now, what makes me a bit depressed is, we've now got a lot more women in Parliament than we had, even 10 years ago, and that's all great. But it's the casual and sort of low-key sort of elements of sort of the sexism And my example of it, which is we still don't know what to do about. And my example of that would be social media and the way women are treated on social media, and the fact, like the extraordinary abuse that some of my colleagues at the ABC and elsewhere get on social media, and the fact that we don't know what to do about it still. Some people say, okay, well, I'll just go off social media. And it happens to blokes as well, but it's particularly bad. It is particularly bad for women and shocking to read a lot of it. Some of them just back off. Some of them just go, right, I'll block everybody, whatever. But these discussions, however, we're still powerless to find a way of calling it out, because it is all anonymous these days. And it infects the body politic, I think, that there are all these discussions going on, which we don't even see anymore on Facebook and things, where people are just feel free to say all of this stuff, to say appalling things about women. And it does influence, the discussions that filter up into places like Sky After Dark. And, I don't know where that fits in, but I suppose I just give it as an example of the fact that, have we actually changed, or has it actually sort of got a bit worse, that people generally feel that they can say whatever they like, and that that's going to have a knock-on effect to politics, as opposed to going, well, we've changed the systems in politics and that'll make it all better. I think politics is only ever a reflection of the society.
Well, I know, Lucy, you've pointed when we've chatted about you saying there is one field, because we must wrap, but there's one field, which is, you say, in education, that the position for young women has improved.
Yes, so this is the paradox. The WEF did a survey of gender, I guess, positioning or gender equity across various spectra. And in education, women are, Australia is number one in terms of equal education between women and men, right? But in terms of equitable economic participation, we are 70th in the world ranking, which shows us that there is a huge spectrum, I think there's a huge, like a world of difference between what women have the potential to do and actually what they end up doing. And we've got to work on addressing that gap from number one in education to number 70 in economic participation. But I completely agree with you, Laura, about social media. And I actually worked with a tech company last year with a couple of other people on trying to identify, statistical anomalies. And it's actually harder to do. We've all seen the pile-ons against some of your colleagues and other people, and they definitely exist. But if you do it over a long period, it's actually statistically insignificant, even the ones, the very obvious ones. So I think one way of addressing that is actually making sure, it's very basic, but actually making sure that anyone online, be they on Facebook or Twitter, wherever they are, actually has an authenticated email address, an authenticated telephone number, an authentic identity, so that you don't get these armies of anonymous trolls who actually you can't identify, sort of roaming and trolling people, because you have to be a very strong person to put up with that stuff. And if you're not a very strong, I couldn't give a toss what you think kind of person, and they're in the minority. Nobody can actually withstand this for too long. And I think Julia had to withstand it for far too long everywhere, not just on social media. If you actually make sure everyone has a name and a face that can actually be called out, it might be in 10 or 20 years' time. Like I think that some of the Julia's trolls, in the real world are actually getting called out too late, but better late than never.
And gradually, those dinosaurs are, bloody well dying off, either career-wise
not enough.
And good damn riddance.
Metaphorically, I don't wish, ill health on anyone, but those values are dying off. Yeah. But, it's better that there be an accounting now than never. And that's the value of strong female lead, Tosca, I think.
I think so too. But, what surprised you, Tosca, when you were making this film? What did you not know?
I guess I didn't really know the evolution of Julia Gillard's personality in that 3 years in terms of how she dealt with the sexism. I was really taken aback by how she evolved in it, and you know, in the very beginning was so kind of giggly and, oh yeah, I hadn't even thought about my earrings, and you know, giggling at Charles Woolley when he says, you know, are you in love with this man? And you know, I just thought, why don't you just tell him to F off? You know, how can you be so compliant and polite? And then by the end, she just wasn't. And I thought, there's a lesson for all of us, you know, and I think maybe if there's a positive that we can come away with, it does feel as though we're all learning that just being polite in the face of this is not going to get us anywhere.
I'd love to talk forever, but we can't. We're running short of time. But I've got to say, it was I saw the doco first as a 20-minute rough cut. It was still in the process, and I found it so exciting for all the reasons that Laura and Lucy are touching on, to actually see the story told through a lens not just of history and of course politics, history, objective reporting. This is all really important. We all live it, you know. Lucy's a prominent lawyer. I mean, we all live this, but to actually see some heat applied to this was hugely. So I personally would like to congratulate and thank you, Tosca, and I would say I hope that not just all women, of course, I hope everybody has a chance to see this, because we don't ever want this to happen again. I mean, when we get our next female Prime Minister, let them go down for what they deserve to go down for. Let them, please, hell, don't let it be tainted by misogyny. Just a last question for you, Tosca. What kind of reaction have you had from your contemporaries?
People, it's been fantastic. I mean, obviously women like the three of you reacting as you do is, you know, makes it all feel worthwhile, but also a lot of young women just saying, oh my God, I can't believe she put up with that. Oh, you know, they're so incredulous. And I think, yes, stay incredulous. That's what we need, and be shocked and don't ever accept this. So I guess, you know, in many ways it was for their generation to say, going forward, this is what must never happen again. So watch it and be forewarned.
Well, bravo, Tosca, because you've taken on misogyny, and with look what she made me do. You took on male violence. I can't wait to see what you do next. And in the meantime, it's been, you know, thank you very much for the Sydney Film Festival for having this film and for giving us the opportunity to talk. Thank you to the wonderful Laura Tingle and Lucy Turnbull. It's just great to have been talking with you, and we'll leave it at that. Enjoy the documentary when you see it. It's a very powerful thing.
Bravo, Tosca.
Thank you. Thank you. No, look, the total highlight is to have you guys talking about it, because we beavered away on it, you know, in total isolation, late night after night after night, thinking, is this ever going to be any good? Are we getting anywhere? So yeah, it's a, you know, amazing thing to sit and listen to the three of you talk about it.
Thank you. Thank you for asking us.
Thank you.